coming on soon. Just waiting for that button to appear for us. Oh, here we go. We are live.
All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Women's Foundation Live. We're here today with author and journalist Elizabeth Renzetti. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, Andrea.
So I'm just going to do our little introduction and then we'll get right into our content here because we want to hear more from Elizabeth in these really difficult times and interesting times. I think you're really going to enjoy what Elizabeth has to say with us today. My name is Andrea Gunraj and I work with the Canadian Women's Foundation, and we're Canada's public foundation for gender equality. We are so excited to have this opportunity to chat with Elizabeth. She's the winner of the 2020 Landsberg Award, which was presented in June earlier this year. The Landsberg Award is an annual award presented by the Canadian Journalism Foundation in association with the Canadian Women's Foundation. It celebrates a journalist who's raising awareness about women's equality issues in Canada, and it aims to inspire an increase in the media coverage and voice of women in Canada. And the award is, of course, named after Michelle Landsberg. She's an award-winning Canadian journalist, author, social activist, and feminist, and it acknowledges the tremendous impact she has had as an advocate and role model for many of us. The award is designed to inspire and support relentless and fearless journalists to consider Canadian news from a women's equality perspective. And I'll give you a bit of background about Elizabeth. Elizabeth is definitely a tour de force. She has worked in journalism for more than 20 years, a columnist and a feature writer for the Globe and Mail. For many years, she worked from the Globe's London and Los Angeles bureaus. And she recently returned from Germany, where she's continued her reporting for the Globe from there. Along the way, in her free time, she's also published 2 books, a best-selling novel called Based on a True Story, and more recently, the bestseller Shrewd. And that's a collection of essays about the lives of women and girls. In it, she wrote, "I have no creed in this world, no religion, no ideology except feminism. It is an essential part of my being." So no surprise that Elizabeth won this Landsberg Award. And of course, it was based on a range of pieces she wrote on gender equality, ranging from violence against women to gender biased design in space to the dearth of women in political leadership. And we can't wait to discuss these topics with Elizabeth, as well as the role of journalism in advancing gender equality these days. I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the meat of it. If we get cut off in the middle of this Facebook Live, please don't be alarmed, just hang on. We'll get right back on and we'll start from where we stopped. If you see any links that you don't recognize, don't click on them, please. People do weird things online and we don't want you to get into any kind of clicking you're not ready to get into, so please don't. But if you are interested in donating to the Canadian Women's Foundation right now, I want to encourage you to give to our Tireless Together Fund. It's an emergency fund for women and girls in the pandemic and moving into the recovery. We know that gender justice is at risk right now, and we've seen the cracks in the system really come out with this pandemic. So there's a lot that we can do to support and make sure that women and girls get every support and just programs that they need and they deserve. So do that at canadianwomen.org if you're able to, and you can also click on the donate button below. So welcome, Elizabeth, again. Great to have you with us.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, I got to say welcome back to Canada. I know that you've done your mandatory isolation period and you're back at it.
Yeah.
And tell me, how are you readjusting to our new pandemic normal and what are you up to these days?
Taking apart and putting back together a lot of furniture, putting a lot of books on shelves, trying to do some writing. It was actually nice to have 2 weeks in which I couldn't go out. I don't think since I could walk, I don't think I've actually been in the house for 2 weeks, because even when we were in Berlin and we were in lockdown, you were still allowed to leave your apartment. And so we would go for long walks every day. So to not be able to leave the house was weird, but so important. So I was happy to do it.
And yes, you just came back from Germany, and we've been seeing the leadership of Germany really highlighted, along with other leaders and who are women around the world, being hailed for their handling of the pandemic. Canada's own chief medical officers have been praised. They've been like superstars, honestly, for their highly visible leadership during this time. And of course, now the topic of women's leadership has been high on people's minds. What impact do you think this attention will have in the long term, if any, in advancing women's role in leadership, particularly in decision-making and political roles? And what about everyday women and girls and those unseen leaders, perhaps, who don't make the news but are doing things in their community that are truly women's leadership?
Mhm. I think what we're seeing is a recognition of a particular kind of leadership that women are, and I don't want to be a gender essentialist, obviously, but there is a particular, lived experience that women politicians bring with them, in which they are required to be more collaborative in order to kind of succeed in their political lives. And I think we're seeing that in the female leaders who are successful in places like New Zealand or in Germany, where I just was. So people talk a lot about how Angela Merkel, who's the German chancellor, what was important was that she was a scientist before she was a politician. And I think that is important. But to me, what was equally important was, and slightly more overlooked, was that what she was extremely good at was getting the leaders of the 16 German states, the Länder, as they call them, on board. And some of the, and all the leaders were men, and some of the leaders were her political rivals who actually want to take her job when she leaves in a few months. So what to me is interesting is that, and then conversely, who is not doing well? And those would be, who we tend to think of as the more authoritarian leaders. So Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump, obviously, in America, and Vladimir Putin. So it seems to me this kind of, there's a collaborative method of achieving success in really difficult times that might be something that women politicians are particularly good at.
I have seen people say that it's not necessary that you are gendered to use this style of leadership, that you're a woman. It's not one in hand, but it tends to be what women might be socialized to use, or might have the space to use, or might be, experts at using because they just do it in their daily lives. So what about the everyday woman and girls who just might be unseen? Do you think that this is going to make a difference for them in the long run, the way that we're focusing on women's leadership right now?
I mean, I would certainly hope so. There are so many barriers and so many to women's participation in public life and in political life. And so many political scientists have studied this, and the barriers are sort of right from the beginning, from the way that networks are formed, to the way that women are recruited into public life, to the way that fundraising happens or doesn't happen. So if I think people see, so-called like movers and shakers behind the scenes, and voters see how successful women's leadership is, especially in the most fraught time, then maybe with luck, hopefully, some of the reluctance, and there is reluctance to vote for women. I mean, we think we're over it, but I've written over and over again about how we're not, in fact, over these biases, which are often unconscious and often implicit in our decision making. But you only have to look at the fact that there are no female premiers in this country right now. And
Yes.
in many ways, premiers are the most powerful decision makers in this country, and we do not have a single one. Whereas I think it was like 4 years ago, there were 6 women who were premiers. Women get elected premier, and then they don't get reelected. So these are things that we need to look at as a society and as voters too.
In terms of other places that you've reported on, what lessons should Canada learn about advancing gender equity with an intersectional lens from them?
Well, Germany just, for example, implemented a gender equality strategy. I'm not sure how intersectional it'll be, unfortunately, because they are, I actually think they're not perhaps as advanced as we are in North America in thinking about these things.
Mhm.
And there's still a lot of racial bias that happens in Germany. But their gender equality strategy, for example, it looks at things like getting women on the boards of corporations and closing the pay gap and things like that. I reported also from America, for years, and there it's really interesting because what you saw after the 2016 presidential election, which was a huge disappointment to anybody who has more than one brain cell, is that the backlash to what happened was that a huge number of women came forward to run for office, and you see women from communities of color, from racialized communities, running for office in number and succeeding in numbers that you don't. Now, again, there's also an incredible backlash, as we see with some of the Congress women in the States, because change is difficult and painful, and people who hold on to power don't like to let power slip through their grasp. So the women who are now, the young women who are in office, I think are kind of at the vanguard and are taking a lot of blows for women who will come after them.
Let's go to the Landsberg Award. One of the prize-winning stories that you wrote was entitled "Violent Misogyny is a Threat to Half of Our Population. We Need to Call It What It Is, Terrorism." It was written on the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre that happened last year, the 30th anniversary, when an anti-feminist gunman left 14 women dead at the École Polytechnique in 1989. The piece reflected on the connections between that massacre and the 2018 van attack in Toronto, which killed 10 people, 8 women and 2 men. In this case, the killer subscribed to that incel ideology folks have been speaking to, which encourages gender-based violence and violence against women, hatred of women. In the piece, you pointed out that 2 of the worst mass killings in Canadian history sprang out of misogyny. Then, of course, tragically, this year we had a mass shooting in Nova Scotia earlier in the year, and you revisited the topic again, given that the shooting started with an act of gender-based violence. So in your opinion, what is the most important things Canada needs to do to prevent and end gender-based violence in your investigation of these things?
Well, it's a huge range of things. The first thing I would say is that we still haven't learned the lesson, considering that the government, both the federal government and the government of Nova Scotia, have resisted calls from not just feminists, but legal scholars and families to have a critical public inquiry into which would examine the motives, for example, of the man who committed the mass shooting in Quebec. So that, in Nova Scotia, and that is it's a travesty. It's as if nobody wants to know what the connections are. It's almost as if we're like, let's just not even think about it until the next time it happens. And it will happen again. It will happen again. So the things that need to happen, I think, and there are so many incredibly smart advocates and scholars out there doing work in this field. And what they will tell you, and I've talked to a lot of them, what they will tell you is the answers are out there. It's just that they're not being implemented. So we know what will work. We know how to, keep women safer. There's no such thing as absolute safety, obviously, but we know how to keep women safer, but these things are not happening for a variety of reasons. So I'd say it's like a whole pipeline, right? At the beginning, we need to teach boys how to deal with their anger. We need to teach them how to deal with their emotions. We need to teach them that women are not status symbols, that there are ways that they can achieve their full personhood without, subscribing to a very toxic masculinity, which is unfortunately still the currency for a lot of men. Then, moving on, you have to look at, for example, women who are in abusive situations and how they can be aided and helped, because as we know, this is a silent epidemic. Women don't want to talk about this. I know women who are in this position personally, and they do not, in many cases, want it to be public for a variety of reasons, which are all completely valid. So then you have to help women who are in these situations. And part of that is giving them a pathway to freedom, if you want to call it that, right? Which is secure housing, which is jobs, which is looking after their children, which is helping them in family court, so that they, don't feel that they're being penalized, that their abusive partners aren't using their children as weapons against them. And speaking of weapons, then there is, of course, the giant issue of gun control. The guns are used in, not in the majority of femicides, but in a large proportion of femicides, and certainly in mass killings. They are the main way that people are killed. So the gun control, the kind of gun control I think that this government, in fact, is, wisely bringing forward. But, like even more, why do we have handguns? I don't understand this. I every time I write about this, of course, I get, gun rights people writing to me about their intrinsic right to own weapons, which I don't really understand. I cannot keep a tank in my garage, like I'm not allowed to have a fighter jet on the front lawn. Why are you allowed to own a handgun? I don't understand. So anyway, it's a long answer to say there's a huge gamut and a huge amount of work to be done, but the work has been done, and over and over again, advocates say this is what needs to happen, and it's just the dots aren't being connected, I don't think, quite yet.
You reminded me on just the early side of that pipeline of prevention. There's a great campaign, I believe it's coming out of the States, called She Is Not Your Therapy. And it reminds me of what we need to do with boys and men in terms of, changing that currency and changing the responsibility for health, mental health and emotional health, and, giving men tools that are not your partner to deal with your pain.
This is I think it's the most crucial issue to me. And, Rachel Giza wrote this fantastic book called Boys, which is so good and so useful. And I go back over and over again, and I quote Bell Hooks, who said about boys, patriarchy will not heal them. If it did, they would all be well.
Yes.
So patriarchy harms women.
Yes.
Equally, it harms men,
yes,
and it harms boys. And this is, I think we do we've done a very good job of giving our girls, our young women, what are considered traditionally like male attributes, encouraging courage and encouraging resourcefulness and things that have been traditionally male. But we have not been very good at encouraging young men to embrace the qualities that we consider to be traditionally female. So that's empathy, compassion, creativity, things like that. And just there needs to be so much more work about it. Even like the language I hear a young man using. There was a guy just the other day, there was a viral video clip of some guy talking about like why you should wear masks, and people were saying, oh, this is fantastic, but he was calling other men beta. Oh, you're beta. And I just thought, like, don't, it's like, it makes me crazy when I hear this language being used, men towards other men.
It's such a hard pattern to break out of, but I think, it's so necessary that we push ourselves to do that, and push ourselves in our communities to do that, in our families. Speaking with a connection about violence and public misogyny, violent public misogyny happening, and then the private violence against women. Can you speak more to what you think needs to happen to tackle these two interconnected forms of violence? Because many people don't even see them as interconnected.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to me because, for example, sometimes like female journalists, especially journalists from racialized communities, come in for like so much abuse online, and it's weirdly hidden, or you get it emailed to you, or you get it DM'd to you. And every time I mention this publicly, people are always seem really surprised. And I think, because to me, it's just so given, I guess, because I read about it so much and I've known about it and I hear about it from other women. So there's an astonishing level of vitriol out there. And I think there is a connection between, there was just a case in Washington, what was that, a week ago, about the judge whose son and husband were shot, and the son was murdered by a men's rights activist. Their violence, not always, but sometimes carries from their private lives into their public lives. And if and results in acts of violence. And for example, there was just a shooting in Germany in Hanau in February, and I think 9 people were murdered. And his manifesto, like the manifestos of Elliot Rodger and other killers, was rife with misogyny. So these things are not unconnected. They're connected. Hatred of the other often includes women, and sometimes it moves from the realm of the theoretical or online to the public realm. And you know what? Even if it just remains in the online realm, it's still terrible and hurtful and violent, even if it is just, this, like people tweeting at you or DMing you or whatever. That's still bad.
Mm. Yes, and it's just as much cause for alarm. I mean, as somebody picking up a gun and harming somebody else. Speaking specifically around the pandemic and some of the impacts that we've seen, we know that there's every indication that violence could be on the rise. That's why we launched the Canadian Women's Foundation. We launched the Signal for Help campaign. It's just a very simple hand signal that somebody can use to let somebody know that they need help without leaving a digital trace on a Zoom call like this one. And of course, we're really aware that the social restrictions that have been necessary in addressing the pandemic can make things worse for women who are living in an unsafe situation and in an abusive home. We also know that women have bore the brunt of job losses, especially early on, and had to take on more unpaid care work, so they don't have time and space for the paid care work. And of course, that has longer term financial implications, and women's participation in the labor market has really tanked. So I'm curious about what you think are the gendered impacts of the pandemic that concern you most, and your thoughts around how we can regain what we've lost as we're thinking about recovery now.
Oh, so many effects. It's been really shocking to me, because of course as economists have pointed out, in other recessions, largely the jobs that were lost were in manufacturing or in construction or in areas where men dominated, and in this it's been service, caring, other fields where women predominate. So on the bad side, it has been shocking and awful, and we keep hearing both anecdotally and in sort of terms of large studies that women are choosing, or not choosing, but being forced to make an untenable decision between, for example, looking after their children and keeping their jobs. And then there's this, what rises from that is this idea that because of the pay gap, men often statistically make more, so they might make more than their wives, and so then they make a purely economic decision for the wife to step back from her work. A couple things come out of this. One, we have to learn to value caring. We have to learn to value caring in economic senses, in terms of treating it as a high status profession. I think of places like Finland, where I visited and talked to teachers, where teachers are like the most exalted profession, and it's very hard to become a teacher, and you get paid a lot. So things like in care homes, in private homes, people need to be recompensed for the caring that they do, whether it's for elder care for people with disabilities, care for children, right? So I think the economist Armin Yalnizyan has that great line, no recovery without a she-covery, and it's true. There will not be a recovery without a she-covery. So what it might do is, in the best possible scenario, is it causes us to rethink the very messed up way that we have warehoused children, warehoused seniors, not valued caring at all, which is predominantly, of course, done by women. So I look at the recovery plans, like YWCA just today, along with the Rotman School, just released their feminist plan for recovery. And I think if we take that seriously, then it's a chance to have an elder care strategy, a national child care strategy, all these things that people have been calling for years, but have been deemed too expensive. Like, what is expensive? Expensive is having an economy that doesn't work, or children who suffer because they have like terrible pre-kindergarten care, or all these things, and or having your elderly in places where they have no dignity of life, which is horrible. So I kind of hope that there will be a sea change after this. And I've written too about the idea of well-being budgets as opposed to GDPs. So using well-being as a measure of a country's progress as opposed to GDP. And interestingly, the countries that are at the forefront of this process are countries run by women. So Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand are all countries that have incorporated a well-being lens into their budgets. And I think Canada was planning to do that in the early 2020, but maybe that got, messed up. I was happy to see, that this government used a feminist lens for, a gendered lens for its last budget. So, I mean, I'm not Nostradamus, so I have no idea what's going to happen, but it is a chance. You get so few chances where society just like cracks like this, and you get to remake it. So I really hope, but it's going to take a lot of people. And this is the problem. It's going to take a lot of people's energy to make this happen. And like, who has energy right now? If you're a woman with like a couple of little kids at home and you're working, like, do you have the energy to then fight for all these monumental changes? So I'm hoping men step up. I'm hoping, people who are outside their childbearing years maybe work on this, and definitely governments as well.
Okay, yeah, folks, we are hearing right now what we need to do. We need to step up, and especially for our men, whom we really look to be allies right now. I think it's an important message for us, especially as we're thinking about voting and we're thinking about like, who are we going to give our votes to and who are we going to support? What are we going to support? It always makes me think about what is an economy for? Why are we here? What is an economy for? Yeah. Is it not for quality of life? Is it not for our collective and individual well-being? I really always go back to that. And like, yeah, we can talk about GDP all we want. We can talk about progress all we want, but what is progress? Progress is when people are doing well and people are not on the line and suffering. I mean, it's simple to me, but it's also complicated. So yeah, I wish you were Nostradamus. I really were. Really wish this. You've been writing about gender equality for so many years, and I am recognizing that these issues have changed and the coverage of these things have changed, but I'm sure you have opinions about what still needs to change and what voices we aren't hearing. Tell me a little bit more about that.
I think just the reckoning we've seen in the past 2 months has absolutely shown us whose voices we are not hearing and whose voices we need to hear more of. And what's been like super heartening to me is to hear people saying, often at the expense of their own perhaps well-being or at the risk of their careers, standing up and saying, this is what's happening. There is, racial injustice in my workplace, in my media workplace, in my whatever workplace. And I'm going to speak my truth and tell you what I've witnessed. And I'm not going to be gaslit or silenced anymore. Because I think that happens a lot. You think, am I just imagining this? Like, is this just happening to me? And so when you get a critical mass of people saying, no, wait, that happened to me too. So this is not just you imagining it, it's a system-wide problem. So my hope is that we will see a reckoning around that, specifically around, the intersectional necessities that we need to move forward. And in Canada, around Black Lives Matter, around Indigenous justice for women and men. And I wrote just recently about the way the police treat Indigenous women. And this is interesting. And, I've written this column many times, and every time I do, I get really like incredibly racist comments. And it makes me think, okay, if I were an Indigenous woman, it would be just so much worse. Some guy wrote me a douchebag and then said, stick a totem pole up your ass, which is just like astonishingly horrifying, but also eye-opening, it's eye-opening. When you see people, it's that old phrase, when people tell you who they are, believe them. So I actually think this is a really good moment in certain ways. And I just hope that the field of journalism opens itself up to more people who are more representative of what this country is now, and not what it was like, 60 years ago.
We were speaking about this in terms of traditional media being in a bit of a crisis of its own, struggling with seismic shifts. And I think it's part of the structure of the way that traditional media has been framed. And now we see that it's really hit hard by the pandemic. And when it's done right, of course, we know that well-researched investigative journalism, it speaks to a hidden story. And I think that's key to meaningful social justice. And I just wonder what you think about where we are now when it comes to the press and the groundbreaking role of promoting gender justice, racial justice, and all forms of social justice we so badly need to pursue today.
Well, I think the answer is hidden in your question because you use the word press. And I think what's happened is you've seen this as kind of traditional media does shrink. So broadcast or newspapers and magazines, you're seeing kind of an explosion elsewhere in storytelling, in journalism, online platforms, podcasts, stuff like, Connie Walker's Finding Cleo podcast. Just the other day, I was watching a lecture by Pam Palmater, the wonderful professor lawyer from Ryerson University on YouTube. And I thought, okay, like from home, I get this hour-long, incredibly interesting history lesson. And 20 years ago, that would not have been available to me. So I think, or, outfits like Media Girlfriends who are just doing like superb work, encouraging, women from traditionally overlooked backgrounds to find work and pursue careers in journalism. There's so much hopeful stuff happening all in the corners, but journalism has a failed economic model right now. It's not a readership crisis at all, or a listener crisis or a viewer crisis. It's just a crisis in revenue models, right? So there needs to be a revenue model that works, but there's just an incredible amount of you can't keep up with the incredible investigative, amazing storytelling going on. It's just everywhere.
And I guess it's not all doom and gloom then for the role of investigative journalism. And I do wonder about feminism, how that has played a role in your career, in your writing that it could be journalistic, but also you've done novels as well. And how has that feminist influence changed over your career?
Yeah, so I wrote about this in one essay in my book because I'm extremely old. And so in the 90s, there was a lot of, what did we call it then? There was a name for it. It was like power feminism or can-do feminism or something. It was like you're Carrie Bradshaw and you're like wearing your Manolo Blahniks and pole dancing your way to liberation. And it was a very individual way of looking at empowerment. It was like, if I'm okay, then everybody's okay. And I think we now recognize that as a kind of a weak and useless way of advancing everyone, of rising all the boats, because what we need instead is not to look at how individuals necessarily are succeeding, but how the systems of oppression that have been in place for ever, how those continue to work behind the scenes to keep women oppressed, and to keep them the victims of violence and injustice and economic injustice. So once we start to look more at the systems and less about individuals, I think that was the big change for me. And that was maybe just as I got older in the last 10 years or so, I started to think more about that.
Well, I think this is such a cute thing. I shouldn't use the word cute. It's a powerful thing. In your book, Shrewd, you talked about a dream about being called to a university commencement speech and what you'd say. I love that because I think many of us have this image of, the wisdom that we would pass on. So what would you have said to young women graduates this particular year if you were called on to do a commencement speech?
I think I would say what we just talked about, which is this is a historic opportunity for you to rethink and reimagine your future and not be guided by other people's expectations of what your future should be. I wrote about this also in the book, that I think we have a kind of a very constricted idea of what ambition is, especially for women. We think of ambition only in terms of work often, sometimes family, but not the totality of your life. You might be ambitious to be an amazing volunteer or like a really good sister, mother, friend, whatever. And your ambition can be for work, absolutely. And that's fantastic if it is. But we live in a society right now that values status in a very, very, very constricted and painful, and I think demeaning and crushing way, and doesn't let people experience kind of the totality of their personhood so that they can have different ways of succeeding. So I would say to a young woman graduating, to listen to your intuition, to actually understand what it is that you want, and that you don't have to live the way that everybody else lives. You don't have to have the same job that everybody else has. You don't have to have a house. You don't have to, if you want a house, that's fine, but you don't have to have those things. You don't have to have children. That's, if you want them, also excellent. But if you don't let anybody talk you into, it's a very bad idea. I've had people say to me, women say to me, like, I'm not sure. And I always say, if you're not sure, like, really, it's a lifelong commitment. You're in it for the long haul. So yeah, think about it. Anyway, so I would just say, we're living in a particularly like blank page time. And that's a gift to be able to write your own story in whatever way you want. And that's not to say that things aren't hard, because they are hard. There's a lot of unemployment out there. Things are very difficult. But you can use this moment to, as you say, think about what we value as a society and as individuals.
Folks, for you who might just be joining us, we're here with Elizabeth, and we're speaking to journalism and writing and feminism and all the things that really are so important right now, as we know. And one of the things that you've reminded me of, Elizabeth, is this idea of it's so important then to hear different voices, to be able to envision your life in different ways. And I think that's making the case about, having a multiple forms of storytelling, multiple forms of journalism, opening space for that, having revenue models to allow that to proliferate and grow, and not just be relegated to the corners as perhaps it has been. And now we're starting to see shifts. So I think we're ready for a bit of a lightning round. We're going to ask you some. This is good. I always learn new things in the lightning round. We're going to ask you some questions. You just tell us your answers off the top of your head. And then we're going to move into some questions from the audience. So we have some great ones that have popped up. Okay, so first lightning round question. Your dream interview subject.
I would actually say the first woman to run for president of the United States in 1872, long before women could vote. And her name was Victoria Woodhull. And she was an advocate of free love and kind of insane and really interesting. So Victoria Woodhull.
Great. Dream journalism project.
Oh my goodness. I travel the world eating the best gelato and writing about it.
Love that. Oh, yes, that would be journalism that would change the world. Most recent TV or Netflix series you've binged?
Babylon Berlin, which is a fantastic Netflix show about Germany just in the rise, just in the Weimar, just before Nazis come to power. It's fantastic.
Probably a little scary compared to,
Yeah.
when you're thinking about what's going on now, I'm sure there's echoes. Oh my goodness. Most empowering song or anthem?
I don't know if it's empowering, but when I need to like, have a hype song to get myself out the door, I find Madonna's Hung Up really gets me out the door. Yeah.
See, you learn things. Three, three famous people you would have in your pandemic isolation household. And this can be like real people, these can be characters.
Characters. I'm going to say Ursula Franklin, the great Canadian feminist, pacifist, writer on technology. So Ursula Franklin, Toni Morrison, and Carrie Fisher, who's like my favorite, pretty much my favorite writer. I love her.
You picked some really serious and great names. I thought SpongeBob right away. I don't know why. I don't know why. You're much deeper than I think I am in that question. Your reality show, what would it be called and what would it be about?
Well, my reality show is The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. So I love it. I have a sick and abiding passion for The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. So maybe mine would be like Old Married Lady would be my reality show. It would be very, very, very boring. And it would just involve my husband and I yelling at each other about the dishes.
Being grumpy. I'd watched Elizabeth. I think I would relate to that somehow. A writing habit that you wish you could start.
Oh, not procrastinating. So like actually when I should start writing. Yeah, that would be good.
We just spoke to a writer who said that she can write anywhere and even in between, like, going from one place to another in her car, she takes that 5 minutes to write.
Wow.
And I thought, wow,
who was
you
that?
put us to shame, my dear.
Who was that?
Oh, that was Emma Donoghue.
Oh, yes.
And she just has a new book coming out.
Fantastic writer.
Yes, that's right. The Pull of the Stars is the name of the book that she's got coming out. Yeah. So Emma Donoghue is the gold standard, I think, that we have to look to. A writing habit you wish you could stop.
I use too many M dashes, I would say. Yeah, too many M dashes.
I love M dashes.
I know, and people are snobby about them, and they're always like, it's a lazy way of writing. But
yeah, that's right.
Just it works for me. It works for me.
That's right. Describe yourself using only one word.
Funny. I know it doesn't seem like that, like for the past hour.
We were asking you some questions that did not allow you to be funny, in all fairness.
I'm actually a funny person.
That's important. Okay, your career, if you had to describe that using only one word, what word would that be?
Long.
Wow. Amazing. That's the word I would use for your career.
Thank you. It's very
yeah. If you weren't a journalist, what would you be?
I might work at a racetrack because I love horse racing. I would work like a set designer in a theater. Yeah, because I love theater. So I would love to work backstage at a theater. So something totally different from what I'm, doing now. It's not too late. Could be my plan B.
Speaking of theater, again, Emma Donoghue was talking about her great love of theater productions that are now online for free in the pandemic.
Yes, I watched some of them, like from the National Theatre in Britain.
Yes.
It's been wonderful to see those things.
They're so good. Oh my goodness, I've been raving about them. I can't stop. Okay, so yeah, that's our lightning round, and now we have some questions from the audience. These are good. Okay, how have you felt over the years that we're making progress when it comes to covering issues that matter for women and girls? Are we making progress? And do you feel that, you can point to something? And you did mention some of this, but please answer this for Kate.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yes, sometimes I do. Yes, sometimes I feel like, yes, like there's so much of kind of a groundswell, and every time I write about, like femicide, people are. But on the other hand, I just watched a retro report about was it Francine Hughes, who was the woman who murdered her husband in 1977 after he had brutally abused her for years. And it was about talking about how in 1977, intimate partner violence was considered a silent epidemic. Nobody talked about it. Nobody talks about it now. And about how the number of women in prison, incarcerated now, which continues to rise at a ridiculously disproportionate rate to the number of men who are incarcerated, the number of women who have been sexually or physically assaulted is huge. It's like 2/3 or something like this. So yes, I think we are making great strides. And in other ways, I feel like change is very, very, very slow. And it's that, what do they call it? The last mile problem. Last mile is really the trickiest. Why? It's the hardest, it's the most invisible, most intractable part.
Do you feel that you're repeating yourself in these stories that you're telling? Do you feel like, gosh,
Yes.
I'm just a broken record here?
All the time. I feel like the first column I wrote for the Globe and Mail was in, I can't believe I'm going to say it, 1993, and it was about domestic violence. That's 27 years ago. I feel like I've been writing the exact same column over and over. And I actually feel like, my editors one day are just gonna be like, can you just write about penguins or something and just stop? Because yeah, I feel like I write the same thing over and over. And believe me, I would not like to have to write about this. I'd prefer to write about penguins. I really would.
Sure. I can't remember who it was, but somebody famous said, yeah, I'd rather not do activism. I'd be a painter.
Yeah.
If I had a chance.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about the work that you've been doing, like has been steady around speaking to domestic violence, gender-based violence, violence at home. I do wonder if you feel that the narrative in what people are reporting on, you included, has that shifted? Has that changed? Has that gotten more complicated or perhaps focused differently?
It's totally gotten more complicated. And what's interesting is now it's bound up in the questions about how we fund police, what police should be investigating, and what they are better left not to investigate, what is better left to people who are actual experts in these fields. So in terms of intimate partner violence, for example, and we become, and it's funny, I was thinking about this the other day when my mother was a single parent. I was living with her. We were living in St. Jamestown, which is this kind of high-rise development in downtown Toronto. And there was a guy upstairs above us who was clearly beating his wife. And we called the cops on him. And the cops talked to him, then came down and talked to us and said, he says his wife is crying because she's had a fight with her mother. And I was like, really? Because like we hear her being, thrown around constantly. And it seems to me that was a long time ago. And police have gotten better, obviously, at investigating intimate partner violence, but it's still not their realm. And there are so many better ways to prevent it and to, police it, if you want to call it that. So I think, yes, in that one area, for example, it has to be part of what we think about when we think about shifting resources away from police forces and police services into better community care.
Here. Michelle, she asks, hi, Elizabeth. What are your top 3 summer reads?
Oh my goodness. I just read Kylie Reid's book, Such a Fun Age, which was just longlisted for the Booker Prize. I read Oyinkan Braithwaite's My Sister the Serial Killer, which I loved. It's so funny and very dark. So I liked both of those a lot. And I read a book about cholera. I read a book about disease and how essentially public health and disease called The Ghost Map, a really amazing book about cholera outbreaks in London in the 1840s. And it just has so many parallels for what's happening today. It was really good. So those would be 3 that I just read.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, and then Emma asks, what's giving you hope right now?
All those young women who I read about, who are just so loud in the best possible way, like loud, funny, um, unafraid. No, not unafraid, because I don't like that word. Everybody's afraid of something, and you should be
Yes, of
afraid
course.
of certain things because the world is dangerous. But brave and resourceful and loud. And I see them coming up, and I hope that I'm specifically thinking about young women journalists in Canada, and I really just hope that the environment is welcoming to them, and they don't like end up becoming set designers or whatever because we need them.
Mm. Okay, I have another question. Alina asks, have you ever been afraid to publish something because of possible backlash?
Oh God, yeah, yeah, all kinds of things. I'm just trying to think of what right now, but yes, there have been things that I thought. I remember writing about Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I wrote an interview with her, and she's a very interesting thinker, but a lot of people dislike her intensely, dislike her politics. And I remember writing about her and being super careful in what I wrote, and then thinking people are going to pick this apart. And then actually nobody ended up picking it apart. But yeah, there are things that, and then like I was saying, if you read about gun control, you're
Yeah.
going to get so many people telling you you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, blah blah blah, because you would like, for people not to be murdered on the street. You get a lot of backlash, so you have to be prepared for that.
Mm. Okay, so Jessica asks, is there more writing books in your future?
I hope so. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I hope so. I mean, the dirty truth is that I mean, I don't have any like family money. Unfortunately, I wish I did. And it actually costs a lot of money to write a book, believe it or not. Like, it's not a very lucrative thing. Um, it is for some writers, probably. Margaret Atwood, I'm sure, bless her, makes a lot of money, and she should because she's a genius. But the I do it for love. I love writing, and I like writing the books I've written. I've working on fiction right now, so I'm trying to hopefully have a novel before too very long. And then I'd like to write more nonfiction too, maybe some kind of journalistic or. But again, it's the the market for nonfiction is not huge in Canada. So if you're going to write a book like that, you kind of have to try to sell it around the world so that you don't bankrupt yourself.
In terms of the stuff that you're working on right now, can you share anything about those projects?
Do you mean journalistically or like
Oh,
novel?
I'm specifically thinking the novel because I'm a little
Oh,
obsessed with storytelling. So tell me, I want to know the inside scoop about your novel that you're working on.
I'm working on two, and all I can say is one is a kind of set in a dystopia,
Uh-huh.
which is like kind of sad because I figured, does anybody actually want to read about dystopia? And the other one is kind of a funny novel based around what happens when you lose most of your family. That doesn't sound very funny, actually. It doesn't sound funny at
Oh,
all. Kind of darkly funny, I guess you would say. But yeah,
oh yeah.
I like writing fiction a lot. So
So you like the dark comedies, do you?
those are my favorite books. Are like Evelyn Waugh, very dark satirical. I love Samantha Irby's essays, which are very funny but very very, they have like a real edge to them, which I love. So yeah, I like. And Carrie Fisher wrote about her profound struggles with um, mental illness, and she wrote about like having ECT therapy, shock, what we used to call shock therapy, and she would do it in a funny way. So like you can write about all subjects, I think, in a way that kind of brings people along with you.
And I think, you know, we're almost coming close to the end of our time, but is there anything that you would leave us with in terms of the topics that we've spoken about today, what we need to do as moving forward, you know, those of us who care about gender equality right now and notice that things are not going very well. Those of us who maybe are thinking about the hidden stories and how we can support those hidden stories coming out. Anything that you would want us to share as we close?
I think just being willing to speak up is really hugely important, and it costs so little. You know, it doesn't, most people don't have any extra money right now. I mean, if you do, it would be lovely to, you know, spread it around if you do, but just speaking up about some of these issues and being, it costs nothing to educate yourself on these topics. All of the stuff is out there. I always say, like, you were born with 10 Google fingers, you know, like, so make use of the library is free, make use of it all. There's kind of no excuse. And also I would say just use this moment, which is it's a gift. It's weird and it's painful. It's awful in many ways, but it's also a gift because things don't have to go back to the way that they were before, and people don't have to be the way they were. You can use this to personally change or to look for institutional change. So I would say, like, speak up and have your eye on the opportunity for change.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for joining us. You have said some wonderful things, and you've really brought us, I think, to the heart of what the Canadian Women's Foundation is about and why we're here supporting the things that we do. So thank you very much for joining us, and many congratulations to you for the Landsberg Award and for your incredible writing, your incredible journalism. And we got to see a glimpse of your hilariousness. And we look forward to your next novel, the dark comedy that you will
Thank
be
you
putting
so
out.
much, Andrea. It was really an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Folks, as we close, I just want to remind you that the Canadian Women's Foundation, we build gender equality and we support work all over Canada, working with diverse women, girls, and community. And these efforts, as we know, are just more important than ever. In the pandemic, as Elizabeth said, we don't want to go back to the way things were. That would be a waste of what we're going through right now. We want them to be better for everyone. And we know that when women and girls thrive and gender equality becomes the norm, everybody benefits. It's not just a, one group or one set of the population. Everybody will benefit. So that's why we're raising funds for women and girls and the grassroots programs that support them through the Tireless Together Emergency Fund. This is designed to help women and girls get what they need in the pandemic and making sure that these services don't close in the next few months, but that they're there to keep doing the good work that they're doing into the future. So if you are able to give right now, and we know this is a tough time, but if you are able to give and you want to get in on it, you can do so at canadianwomen.org. That's our website. And you can also give in the donate button below. Please know that every dollar counts and will make a difference in a very challenging time for lots of us. So thank you again, Elizabeth. Thank you everybody for joining us and for your great questions. Take care and be safe and well. Bye-bye.